Hello and welcome to the What is Justice Roundtable discussion. I'm Sosamma Samuel-Burnett, and I serve as the founder and president of Global Justice. And I'll also be serving as your moderator for today's roundtable discussion. If you're joining us in the live audience, I encourage you to turn off your other computer programs for the best audiovisual experience. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important and timely conversation on biblical justice. We have three tremendous leaders from Crown College here with us today as panelists. Welcome, panelists.
Hi, Sosamma.
I'd like to first introduce to you Scott Moats. Scott Moats serves as the Provost of Crown College. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Sosamma.
We also have with us Bethel Kebede, who is a student, an international student at Crown College. And we also have with us Darin Mather. Darin is currently the Assistant Professor for Global Studies, as well as the Social Sciences Program Chair in the School of Online Studies. Welcome, Darin.
Thanks for having me.
All of our panelists today are coming to us from Minnesota, from St. Bonifacius, as well as St. Paul. So welcome, panelists, again. We're going to get right into our conversation, and we'll start with you, Scott. We have this conversation monthly about this issue or topic of biblical justice, a really important one, but sometimes a hard one to get a grasp on. Given your background as a leader, as an academic, a person who has traveled and worked in many contexts, please tell us what your perspective is on biblical justice. How do you see that concept, both personally and professionally?
Yes, well, thank you. It's an interesting concept because it's an evolving concept for me. As I was thinking about this and preparing for this, as I go back to this kind of biblical mandate that we have to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And so as I look at these different aspects, it's all rolled into one. It's hard to pull apart. But the fact of the matter is, if we act justly, it has to be tempered and or built into the context of love. And humility has to go along with that. So as we have this construct of biblical justice in our head, we have to actually play that off against life and experience. So I can have an idea of what justice is, but if I don't actually experience it and apply it, it becomes just an academic construct. So it's the ability to act justly, to understand that this is rooted in God's character. Then the idea of mercy is perfect examples of what Christ did for us in allowing us to have life outside of our own sinfulness and to keep on going, and then to always understand our relationship with God. So it's a vertical, it's a horizontal, and it's an understanding of who we are as a presence and person of the three-person Godhead. And outside of that, an understanding and being connected to the Godhead, I don't know if there is such a thing as justice. And that's where I think we run into problems in our world today, is we're not connected to that source to understand what justice is, and it becomes situational ethics. And then it gets to be a mess.
And I really appreciate those comments. You know, that's a reference from Micah 6:8. And, you know, for many purposes, it really is the grounding for understanding biblical justice. I liked your reference to so horizontal and vertical, but as well as head, heart, and hands, in a sense, the practical part. Darin, I'll have you come into the conversation too. So same question, you know, from your extensive background, both in academics and also, you know, working internationally, what is your personal and professional perspective of biblical justice?
Yeah, I guess when I think about biblical justice, three things come to mind for me, Sosamma. First of all, I think that biblical justice really emphasizes healthy, just, reconciled, restored relationships. So that relationship piece is really key in the Bible. And of course, that starts with a healthy, just, reconciled relationship with God, and then it extends to our relationships with others, even the world, the environment that we're in. Secondly, for me, I spend a lot of time talking about holism and holistic ministry, and I think biblical justice really is holistic, and we see that a lot in Scripture. I think it's rooted in God's vision of shalom that's kind of this broad sense of wholeness and health and harmony. So God created a world that was good in every way, and then sin came in and messed up pretty much every aspect of life. So I believe that God's wanting to redeem every aspect of life, be it the spiritual or the social, physical, emotional, our economic structures, political structures, those kinds of things. So I think justice, we need to look at it holistically and trying to redeem and address every part of life. And then for me, the last thing that I think about when I think about biblical justice is that it's clear that as a God of justice, our God really has a preference for the poor, for the oppressed, for those who are disadvantaged. And you see that in a lot of ways in Scripture. You see it just starting out in Exodus, where he rescues the Israelites who were oppressed in Egypt. You see it in the laws that he gives to the Israelites that are designed to protect the poor, to protect those who are oppressed. The words of the prophets, confronting the rich and the powerful, standing up for the poor and the oppressed. And then it really comes clear to me in just Jesus' own mission statement in Luke 4, where he says, the Spirit has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, bring release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. So for me, biblical justice really should focus in many ways on the poor, the oppressed, the disadvantaged. And I think that's not because God necessarily loves the poor more than any of the rest of us, but when I think God looks at the world as it is, he sees that the scales are kind of tilted away to the disadvantage of the poor. So he kind of puts his thumb on the side of the poor to kind of help make things more fair. So those are three things that I really think are important themes for biblical justice.
Great. It's really interesting. I really like that everything you shared is very consistent with a lot of what Scott has already shared, but this idea of being holistic. In a way, that's a revolutionary way of looking at justice. People tend to put justice into certain boxes, but in reality, it's all of it. And and that relational piece is important as well. And of course, the Bible is full of references to caring for the disadvantaged and those that are in need. And I think underscoring that was very important. Bethel, let's bring you into the conversation. Given that you've heard Scott's and Darin's sort of understanding, do you agree with that, or do you have a different perspective? You come from Ethiopia, and you may have a different reference point, both culturally and in terms of the regional perspective. How do you see this idea of biblical justice from your personal viewpoint?
I think I completely agree with what both Dr. Moats and Darin have said. And I think that the Bible emphasizes the value of human beings. So I understand how it can be holistic, because it kind of tries to break this cycle of injustice. And that's what we hear through all of Jesus' teachings and everything that we read from the Bible, is that there is like an interruption in the cycle. And a movement towards the wholeness of this perpetual cycle of injustice. So how I see it is it's definitely holistic, because it understands God urges us to understand the value of the human before we try to solve the issues of the human and try to solve the issues of injustice.
That's an excellent point. I think a lot of times we go straight to policies, or we get straight to these other sort of structures, but really it starts with human beings, doesn't it, and a value for the dignity of every life. And I think that you're really touching on that well, Bethel. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to actually this time maybe start with you, Darin, in terms of the next question, which is, we have these different definitions and understandings of biblical justice, but we also have to distinguish it between other forms of justice. There's a lot of other terms: criminal justice, restorative justice, social justice. How do you see biblical justice distinguished from those, or are they not distinguishable?
Well, again, I think all of those forms of justice are important, but most of the injustices that we encounter in life, we need to address from a more holistic perspective. there's a distributive aspect to it. There's a kind of a criminal justice aspect to a lot of things. So again, I think from a biblical perspective, we need to really focus on the relationships that are there, looking holistically at systems that might be contributing to injustice, and hearing different sides of perspectives. So I think taking one narrow view of justice just doesn't help us get there, because we are a whole people. We live in societies that are very complex, so we need to come at it from a very broad perspective, I think.
Great. And Bethel, did you have sort of the same idea about distinguishing? You were a double major, right, in both criminal justice, social justice. How do you see those terms in light of this broader term of biblical justice that Darin mentions?
I think that justice is the initial response to injustice. So it's hard to put it in a certain box. It's just that there could be injustice in different aspects of life. There could be injustice in the criminal justice system. There could be injustices in how people are treated in everyday life. There could be injustices in how social interactions are carried out, whether that could be like racially or culturally or gender-wise. But whatever that might be, it's just the response to the injustice. So it's difficult to put it into just one box. So you can't just explain justice as, oh, it's just criminal justice, or it's just restorative justice, or it's just social justice. All of them are kind of interwoven into each other. So none of them can exist by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Great. And similarly, Scott, I'll ask you the same question. So how do you distinguish biblical justice from these other forms? And especially in a world where not everyone is a Christian and not everyone would have a biblical perspective, how do we share that with others?
Yeah, it's an incredible concept, and that I'll take maybe a slightly different stroke at this, but look in the context of when Micah 6:8 was written. So Micah's talking to the people, and it's kind of this dialogue that he's presenting to the people in a response toward God. And the final verse is right before he delivers, this three-point sermon, if you will, to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly. He talks about this idea of he exaggerates. He says to Lord, should I sacrifice my firstborn son? Should I give you all this oil? Should I give you all this stuff? And how can I actually manage all this in my life and in the life of the people? And then in verse 8, it becomes the critical component. And he says, he has shown you, O man, what is good. And I love the next phrase, and it says, what does the Lord require? The word require is probably better translated as, what does the Lord demand of you? What is the foundation? What's the bedrock that we all have to live by? And we then boil it down to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. So what does that mean? In my estimation, what that means is that all of what we do, say, and act flow from this idea of acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly. So restorative justice is an outpouring of bringing restoration from this understanding of love and justice that God is rooted in God's character. Social justice is rooted in this concept of acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. And so distinguishing is it's bedrock, it's foundational, and everything flows from that. And it's more, either we look at it sociologically, we look at it from a psychological perspective, from different disciplines, we call it different things, but foundationally it has to flow from our relationship with God. And if it doesn't flow from the relationship with God, we struggle. And so in our world today, Darin and I talk about this often, in our world today, there is such injustice, and we're all grasping for straws, and we're never going to reach justice without understanding of who we are, who God is, and letting those pieces flow from one another. And then it becomes just a matter of practice. It becomes a matter of putting it to the test. It becomes a matter of living what God has asked us to live and to act the way He's asked us to act. And I agree with Darin. He said it better than I could have said it, but he talks about, God loves us all, right? But I think there's a special place in God's heart for the needy and the poor. Even if we look at the book of Luke, Luke was desperately aimed toward the downtrodden, the women, the people that didn't have anything. And his whole gospel was written in this kind of context that God loves you. And so if we are actually paying attention as believers, we have to have a special attention to those that are in need. And it's, what does the Lord require of you? What is the demanding aspect of your essence of who you are in Christ? Well, that's that idea of loving and acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly. And if we don't do that, I'm not sure we're actually living the mandate that God has called us to live. Now,
what strikes me about what you share is, when we talk about the secular world and trying to understand, a biblical concept in a secular context, part of what Global has been promoting is this idea that it makes sense. So even though these principles may not necessarily be understood fully by someone that maybe isn't a Christian or maybe doesn't have that sort of God perspective, they can still understand this idea of acting justly or loving mercy, inherently. There's something in that they can relate to, and what you were saying about the way that we treat others and the way that we help others. And you don't have to be a Christian to help others, right? But it's this sort of stepping stone toward understanding this bigger concept, and that's where this faith piece comes in. That's what I'm hearing from you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I also want to bring up sort of a practical element in this, is that you all three have brought some very important aspects of this biblical justice definition and distinguishing it from maybe the other forms that we hear. But let's apply it to some specific justice issues. What are some issues for you personally that are important for this application of biblical justice principles? So Bethel, maybe I'll start with you. Is there a particular global justice concern where you see biblical justice principles apply?
Yes, definitely. I see a place where they need to be applied. Can I discuss on that?
And is there a particular issue you want to highlight in regard to that?
Yes, definitely. I want to highlight where this idea of charity towards poverty comes from. Because I feel like I strongly believe that the root of charity is pity. And the root of that pity is seeing what we have and seeing the lack in other people's lives. However, I feel like if we came about it from a perspective of, I want to see my brothers and sisters thrive. I want to see them get to a point in their lives where they can lift themselves up out of this cycle of poverty, rather than saying, I'm doing this to make myself feel better because I feel pity towards these.
That's a great point. And, it's interesting. I recently read an article about charity in Haiti. Haiti has been struck with some tremendous difficulty after the hurricane disasters, but then even prior to that, because it is a poverty-stricken country. But the article took a very interesting tack where it says that charity can sometimes be destructive if it's not applied in the way that you want it to be applied. So you raise a very interesting point. It's about really empowering communities and aiding and supporting communities that have some type of disadvantage, but not making them reliant on charity or thinking that the charity is strictly about the giver and not the receiver. I think that's a very interesting concept that you bring up, and very timely. I think I'll go back to you now, Scott. When you were talking earlier about Micah 6:8, etc., is there a specific issue that really for you resonates with these biblical principles of the global justice concern of yours?
Yeah, briefly, I'll say it like this. Yesterday we had a student that was struggling and didn't have enough resources his mother had passed away, and he needed some resources to essentially bury his mother. And through a series of events, some of his money was locked up into financial aid. So the faculty member came to me and I said to them, look over your left shoulder, and on my wall in my office there's Micah 6:8. And I said, how do you respond? And at that point in time, we all stopped and we said, we respond with mercy. The letter of the law says this, mercy says this, we're going to respond with mercy. Now, the reason why I say that and give you that story was that happened yesterday. But more importantly is justice starts in your office. That's the issue where you put it. So we saw from our initial centeredness and we move out. So if we start there, it'll radiate to our next step, to our next step. But you know, it starts in your office. You apply it to where you are that day, when you have an opportunity, and then you just keep applying it. And I don't want to say it ever gets easy, but you got to start somewhere. It's the small things. It's the decision you make today, which will parlay into a life of decisions, which will parlay into a group of people, which will parlay into a society and a country, and therefore, and go on. So you apply it right now in the situation that you're at.
Absolutely, and I think that methodology makes a lot of sense. You know, just applying that methodology, do you have a particular global justice issue that you'd like to highlight where that methodology would work well?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that has really hit my heart right now is, because of the position I'm in, is first-generation college students. What is access look like to first-generation college students that don't have an opportunity because of where they grew up, their experience at home, or their parents didn't go to college, or something financial, whatever it would be? You apply, how do we make and lower the barriers into Christian higher ed so these people can have an opportunity to live out their God-given talents through a college degree? And the disparity between ethnicities, underprepared students, students that are growing up in poverty, how do we give them access to an opportunity to come to school and to be successful in school? It's a very complex set of issues, but nonetheless, that's where I would apply, if I could, these concepts of starting today, helping one student to move on and beyond, and then eventually let's educate the world. And I believe in our Christian higher ed opportunities that we have opportunities that our ones don't have. So we've got to get this right, because this is what we're about.
I really appreciate that. In some ways, I feel like, you know, education access or educational justice really is kind of a gateway issue, because it opens up a range of other opportunities and concerns depending on whether you do or don't have access. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Darren, same question for you. You know, you work on global studies issues and you work on social science issues. So is there a particular issue that for you personally is of great concern in terms of, you know, this application of biblical justice?
Sure. Yeah, there's, you know, a lot of issues that I'm really concerned about. I've talked some about the poor, work with an international development organization. That's kind of my specialty. But, you know, recently there's been an issue that's really hit home for me, almost literally, and it's been on my mind a lot lately, and that's the issue of race relations in America, and especially with the African American community. I've lived for the last 20 years in an African American neighborhood, and my wife has worked for many, many years in a school that's about 95% black. So we regularly, in our lives and in our experiences and listening to our friends and neighbors hear about the discrimination that African Americans face. We see the economic disparities, inequalities in education, our schools, healthcare, etc. And then just this past summer, I'm sure most of you remember the story of Philando Castillo, who was the man who was killed, one of the men who was killed by a police officer this summer. He was shot not far from my house. Philando actually graduated from high school just a few blocks from my house, grew up, lived and worked in my neighborhood. So just you know, for several weeks after that, just our whole neighborhood was involved in protests and just to watch that, to watch people grieve, to hear people's anger, just to walk through that is really kind of struck home for me, and and to show the importance of this issue. So, you know, for me, from a biblical perspective, I think that there's a lot that can be done. And there's a lot that people like me from the white community can do about this issue. I often see whites and white Christians in social media and other places may get defensive about this issue or deny or accuse or just kind of ignore it, hope it goes away. And for me, when I see reactions like that, in some ways it makes me angry. It really makes me sad. I think there's other ways that we could respond. You know, find ways to reach out to the African American community and just grieve with them. That's something my pastor has been trying to lead us to do in our church, to hear some of the fear or acknowledge some of the anger that they face or are experiencing. Be open to admitting that we all have biases and try to learn to address those. Acknowledge that there are injustices in our economy, our schools, our justice system, and see what we can do to maybe address those. So just being really intentional about finding ways to restore relationships, to reach across divides, and to try to make our systems more fair. Those are things that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Absolutely, so timely and so important. You know, even in our panel today, you know, when you cover the different topics that you've covered, it all comes back to this idea of relationship. And so, you know, your topic is really about relationship. You know, how can we acknowledge and value all people in all circumstances and regardless of backgrounds, and how do we do that in a way that honors everyone involved? You know, that's one of the challenges in not only racial reconciliation, but in a lot of other biblical justice concerns. And so, you know, I really appreciate you sharing that in such a personal way also, Darin. Thank you for that. Well, we have just only a couple of minutes left, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to highlight some of the great things that you're doing in this front at Crown College. And I want to maybe start with you, Bethel. Tell us a little bit about something you might want to share as you're going through your studies there at Crown College.
Well, we had to do this project for our class where we define justice and peace and love and respect, and those are the things that we were working through. And I came across this, which I just love so much. And it was Martin Luther King Jr. And he said that justice was love correcting that which revolts against love. I was like, that really touched me, because at school I'm involved in a lot of things, but we try to get students to go out into the community and try to do things. But the core of all of that is love. It's because we love the people that we're with, we love the people in our community, and we want to see them try to thrive. And I see where Dr. Moats is coming from when he says that he wants to aid students through this process of going through college, or I see what Darin needs, and all of that is coming from love. And this is coming from that innate love that we feel from our God, because we know it and because we see it. And I feel once we understand this, and once we understand like the source of this need that we have for justice, then we can like make so much happen.
Yes. Yes. You know, I'm struck when you said that. It just makes me think of the idea that, you know, we love because he first loved us, right? That kind of captures a lot of what you're saying. Darin, I'm going to ask the same question of you. Some highlights that you'd like to share in terms of your work there with Crown College?
Well, one of the things we're really struggling with at Crown is as a Christian liberal arts school that has some diversity but not a lot, how can we do better to improve diversity and improve relationships between different diverse communities? So I'm a part of a committee that works on that, and there's a lot to do. It takes a lot of work, but it's something that I'm excited that we're pressing forward with at Crown.
Wonderful. Thank you for serving in that capacity. And Scott Moats, I'm going to give you the last word today. So if you wanted to share some highlights about the things that you're doing, you have to oversee so much there at Crown. But any highlights that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I never get the last word, so I'm actually happy.
This is your lucky day.
That are on this call with me are some outstanding individuals at Crown. Darin and Bethel, they're two of our gems at the college. I think the highlight for me of working at this place is to working with people like them. if I could highlight one thing, it's the fact that we have great people that work at Crown College. We have great students that we have a lot of hope in the future. And I look at our people that are going through this school, both in the faculty roles, the staff roles, the administrative roles, and I realize that if we do nothing else, that we bring students here to learn from these people and to go out from here as a result of having known them and been around them, we're in a better place than what we started. And so my role at the college, the thing I get excited about is having opportunities to work with these two people. I agreed with Darin with the ICC committee. Bethel is a major player in the DUSK group, and it is just a phenomenal group of people to work with. So that's the highlight for me every day.
Great, thank you. Thank you again to Scott Moats, Darin Mather, and Bethel Kebede for joining us as panelists, and thank you to our audience for joining us for this session of What is Justice. Please join us again next month. Thank you.